struggle to find creative ways to use simple stamp sets with only a few stamps and no coordinating dies? Today I'm going to show you how to use 4 techniques with the beautiful Stampin' Up Peace to You Cling Stamp set from the Stampin' Up mini catalog for July through December 2022. And if you stay around to the end, I'll have even more bonus ideas. Hello and welcome. I'm Karen Summey, an independent Stampin' Up demonstrator and owner of Karen's Blue Ridge Stamping, and I'm happy you're here today. The Peace to You Cling Stamp Set has 6 stamps and no coordinating dies, but I will be using some dies for a few of today's projects. Don't worry though, you can easily get a similar effect using a good paper trimmer and, if need be, a ruler and a pair of scissors. I'll show you how you can use this stamp set not only for Christmas, but for any occasion, specifically with this church image. We'll see how to change this up very easily to get more mileage out of your Peace to You Cling Stamp set. Let's get started with the first of our 4 techniques. For this first project, I have some samples to show you and then a card to complete. This is the card I'm going to make, and I'm following this one as a sample to show you. If you look closely, you'll see that there are some evergreens around the edges of the card front. These are simply heat embossed with Versamark ink and clear embossing powder. In this case, I've placed a gold foil frame around my image, which I cut to size with my paper trimmer. The stamped church image uses a die cut from the rectangle stitched dies. The gold foil rectangle is the important design element here. I changed my mind in mid-construction and actually have a second foil cut, but it's unimportant for today's video. Now for this card, the stamped image is actually behind the gold foil frame. And let me show you how I got that frame. To get both the narrow and wide frames, I used 2 different sizes of rectangle stitched dies. For the narrow frame I'm using for my demonstration, I used the second and third largest dies side by side in size. You may get a better understanding of this by looking at the full die set on its magnetic sheet. So again, I have the second and third largest dies on my craft table and use them for the narrow frame. For the completed sample with the wider frame, I used the second and fourth largest dies in the set, so I skipped one in between. Again, for the completed card, the stamped image is placed behind the frame. There may be some designs where it matters which one is on top, the frame or the image, but for these cards, these are simply design choices I made for convenience. I won't demonstrate the cutting of the frame today. I'm using this narrow frame because it is a remnant or a scrap of gold foil. I rarely use it, but this stamp set just screamed to have it. The only thing to remember about cutting this type of frame is to space the smaller die cut inside the other one evenly on all 4 sides, and then secure it down to keep it from moving while you make your die cut. If you have some washi tape or any low-tack tape that removes very easily, that will work perfectly. My purpose for this card is to use the stamped church image as my focal point, frame it with the narrow gold foil frame, and use the evergreen heat embossing as I did in the previous sample around the edges to give it some added visual interest. So let me show you how I make the evergreen border for the front of the card. I'm using the Merriest Moments stamp set to get a large evergreen pattern to edge my card. I'm using Versamark ink, which is used for watermarking, and I'll pair it with clear embossing powder to make the pattern on the card front. Because I'll be stamping off the edges of the card, I've placed a mini grid sheet underneath the cardstock to keep my table surface clean. You won't see a lot happening at first since the Versamark ink goes on clear. To make my pattern, I'm simply stamping along the edges of the paper and turning the stamp slightly to vary my patterns. I don't need to stamp the center of the cardstock at all, since it will be covered up by my focal image shortly. Now, as I get into my stamping, I realize that I have omitted an important step. I should have used my embossing buddy on the card base first. This is essentially a powder bag, most likely cornstarch, that keeps unwanted powder from sticking to the card anywhere there's no ink. Next, I start applying my embossing powder before my Versamark ink gets too dry. It's important that the ink is wet so that the powder will stick to it. Once I have the powder applied, I can delay heating it until I finish the rest of the border. Okay, the base is finished. The next step is to place the focal image. Because I have pre-stamped and prepped these pieces, all I have to do now is to just tape or glue these to the card front. And here's a tip for you. Foil and glue are not friends to each other. Getting glue on a piece of foil dulls it right down, and you lose all of that wonderful shine that you were going for in the first place. I opted to use my precision tip glue bottle on this piece, although I could have used some of my narrow tear and tape. You should decide which you're more comfortable doing, and I always make sure I've replaced the cap on the bottle right away, and that ensures I don't let glue dry in the tube and clog up my bottle. Now, since I have glue all the way around this frame and I don't want to get it on the front, I'm using a pair of reverse tweezers to hold the frame while I place it. With reverse tweezers, you squeeze to open them and then let go to hold your paper. When you squeeze them again, they release what you're holding. And here's another tip. When you're pressing an object down that has glue on the back, try to press straight down and don't rub toward the outer edges. That can cause the underlying glue to travel beyond your paper, and then you have glue where you don't want it to be. I'm using dimensionals to pop up the focal image, and as you'll see, I'm very generous with my dimensionals because I don't want the center to sag. In addition to using the hexagonal dimensionals themselves, be sure to use the pieces along the edges of the sheet as well. They also have adhesive, and you don't want to waste all of that good material. I generally use my Take Your Pick tool to pick up the release paper. Once that's done, I center the frame right in the center of the card front, and when I'm satisfied, then I press it down. And here's my finished card front. Now for the inside of this card, I have so many wonderful choices from the July to December mini catalog. While the focal image for this card is from the Peace to You cling stamp set, I decided to mix and match a little bit. So the Hope and Peace sentiment on the front of the card actually is from the Hope and Peace Cling Stamp set on the same spread in the catalog. They're on pages 40 and 41 respectively. I could still use one of the additional greetings from the Peace to You set for the inside, but I'm going to stay with the Hope and Peace set and say tidings of comfort and joy on the inside. So let's quickly recap. For this card, I showed two different techniques: how to make a frame using two sizes of dies, and how to get a full border using a rubber stamp and heat embossing. Now before we leave these techniques, let me just say that there are any number of designs you can use with these. I have an additional sample I made using my layering circles dies. Once again, I used two dies that were side by side in size to get these circle frames. And in addition to the Peace to You and Hope and Peace sets you've seen already, I added in the Merriest Moments stamp set to get these lovely Christmas poinsettias. And with that, let's move on to technique number 3, which is masking. Here are two very vivid samples I made using the masking technique. I have a related video demonstrating how to get these gorgeous blended looks, and I'll leave a link at the end of this video if you'd like to see that one. Meanwhile, the card I'll demonstrate today has a much more subtle application of ink, but the technique is the same. Once again, I'll be combining two techniques for the next card. We'll start with the masking first. Whenever I have a really solid image to stamp, I use my Stamparatus. The Stamparatus allows you to stamp in the same spot multiple times until you have the ink density you want on your image. First, I want to stamp my focal image. I do plan to heat emboss this image, but instead of using the traditional Versamark ink to do that, I'm going to use regular dye ink in the Starry Sky color. The biggest difference here is that I need to work very quickly to get the embossing powder onto the ink before it dries. Okay, before I die cut this, I'm going to go ahead and do my ink blending first, which is technique number 4. I'm changing up the colors just a bit from my previous sample, and this time I'll be using Parakeet Party, Tahitian Tide, and So Saffron. Both Parakeet Party and Tahitian Tide are two of the 5 new Stampin' Up! End colors for 2022 to 2024. To do my ink blending, I'm going to use my Stampin' Up! Blending brushes. These are actually bristled brushes, not foam. Now you can see that mine are well used and well loved. Some people think these should not be cleaned, but I have repeatedly put this under my water tap and rinsed it out with plain water. While some staining does stay behind, a lot of the ink washes out and keeps my brushes working smoothly. When I wash these, I let them dry for 24 hours before using them again, and the bristles come right back to their original shape. Now before I apply the brush to my card front, I always rub it on a piece of paper to be sure it's dry and will not rub unwanted color onto my card. As you can see, this one is dry and ready to go. I like to work from light to dark when I'm blending my colors. I'm using the blending brush I have designated for yellow and similar colors to apply the So Saffron ink. I load my brush with ink and then start off my card front so that I don't get too heavy a concentration of ink at first. Then I simply move on to the paper and start to blend in a circular motion. Now I quickly determined that the Starry Sky ink and heat embossing powder had not completely dried and cured out, and I could see some minor bleeding onto the white cardstock where the point of the image met the paper. Not wanting to have the dark ink on my white paper, I stopped and applied a mask on top of my focal image to prevent any further intrusion. I'm using some old temporary tape on the back to hold it steady as I prepare to blend the rest of the ink on my card front. So now I don't have to worry about smearing the ink that's underneath the mask. Once again, I'm starting with the So Saffron ink and continuing to blend. After the So Saffron, I blend with Parakeet Party and Tahitian Tide in turn. Because of the size of the blending brushes and the small area to be blended, I find I can't see much of the Tahitian Tide, and the piece takes on more green shades than I want. Still, I think it's pleasing enough, so I'll move on to the next stage. First started the blending process without the benefit of a mask on my focal image. I have So Saffron ink on my star. While I initially wanted the star to be yellow, I now find that it doesn't have quite the same look with everything else in white. So I first attempt to use my Stampin' Chalk marker to overcolor the yellow. The chalk marker recently retired, but you may have one still in your stash if you need it for this type of correction. The other pen I've used is a Jelly Roll white pen for the same purpose. While the chalk marker has a wide barrel for large coverage, the Jelly Roll pen has a narrow ballpoint on it. They both serve me well, and you'll see them listed in the supplies list below. Now it's time to frame my stamped and blended focal image. I'll use the scalloped rectangle die from the Scalloped Contours die set. This has been one of my go-tos since I first got the set. It's seen a lot of mileage, and it's an excellent investment for a variety of cards and projects. In the interest of time, I am not demonstrating the die cutting process. You'll find that while the die cut might technically fit in the mini Stampin' Cut and Emboss machine, it really is better suited to the regular size machine. Now here's the complete die cut piece with the focal point. It's time to work on the card base and add the stained glass effect with a mask. I use white craft ink to get this faint image on the starry sky background. For that, I bring in a blank card base, which is already cut to 8.5 by 5.5, scored in half at 4.25, exactly the midpoint, and folded to an A2 size. Then I bring in what I informally call the stained glass mask from the Artistic Mix Decorative Mask Set. I take some time to get the mask straight along the edges of the card base because a crooked mask will be glaringly obvious when we see the finished product. Once I'm happy with the alignment, I use washi tape to adhere the mask to my mini grid paper, which I'll use to keep ink off my craft table. The white ink will be applied all the way to the edges of the card front, so my ink is likely to travel off the edges of my card base. Again, it's important to keep the card base and the mask in alignment. If one starts to move, it will be very obvious to you, and you can simply stop and adjust one or the other back into place. The important thing is just not to panic and to take your time to get the alignment right. I'm using Stampin' Up Whisper White Pigment ink, which has different properties from the usual Stampin' Up water-based dye inks. It has a different feel on the pad as well as on the paper, but there's nothing especially hard about using it. For this particular ink, I'm going to use a sponge to apply it to the paper. I have one that's designated just for white because color inks can easily intrude on the white. I'm using a circular motion to apply the white ink to the paper. I'm trying not to be too heavy-handed because all I want on the card base is a faint stained glass image that adds interest but doesn't distract from the main focal point. Now, I really could have inked only about 1 inch all the way around from the edges because the stamped image will be placed in the center and will cover up a lot of this ink. But I just love watching my paper take on the pattern of the mask, so I inked it all over. And now it's time for the reveal. I wasn't quite satisfied with the top left edge, so I taped the mask back down, being careful to realign the mask and re-inked until I had the coverage I wanted. Now before I put the mask away, I want to tell you that this mask now has ink all over its surface and it needs to be cleaned. A simple rinse in the sink with a little dishwashing soap or even some liquid hand soap will remove the ink and make it ready to use again. The white ink makes it very obvious that the mask needs to be cleaned. But when you use a darker ink, like Starry Sky, the ink rather disappears on the plastic and it's not so obvious that it needs to be cleaned. So just remember that residual ink can intrude on your next project. I generally leave the washi tape affixed as a visual reminder that the mask needs to be cleaned. Now it's time to finish construction of the card front. I pop up the focal image with Stampin' Dimensionals and affix it to the card base. Then it's time to stamp and die cut the greeting I'll place in the bottom left. I'll use the Light of the World greeting as I did in my previous sample. There are also many options for my inside greeting. I used the Peace to Use stamp set for the first sample, but I decided to return to the Hope and Peace stamp set to use one of the greetings there on this current card. Notice that I placed the focal image slightly high on the base so that I would have more room for my greeting on the front. While I wanted to use the small rectangular die from the Scalloped Contours die set for my greeting, I knew that it was too long for this particular greeting. As I did in the previous sample, I shortened this die to make it fit the greeting. I'll publish a companion video soon on how to accomplish this not only for this die, but for many of the Stampin' Up! Dies and punches you may own. So check back soon to see how to do that. Now I'm using a precision tip glue bottle to glue my greeting to the card. Because this is such a small piece, the bottom of the greeting can overhang the focal image without any slump. If I had placed it any lower, then I would have added dimensionals at the bottom part of the greeting to maintain the same height from the card base. And the only remaining step on the front is to add a few embellishments. I love the rhinestone basic jewels. I'm using them in their natural state here, but you can also color these with your Stampin' Blends markers to make them any color. As I always try to do, I place the jewels in a triangular pattern for visual appeal. The largest jewel is in the center of the star to give it greater emphasis. And our card front is finished. I hope you've seen how easy it is to make this beautiful card. Okay, I told you early on that I would have a bonus technique at the end of this video, and I want to thank you for staying with me. In the next couple of minutes, I'll show you how I transformed snowy, wintry scenes into other seasons for any occasion. For this early spring Z-fold card, I didn't change the image at all. I simply changed my color scheme and my message. But there's an even better way to change the seasons. Here's how. I'm using my Starry Sky ink and a Stampin' Up blender pen to make this transformation. Some of the dots in the sky are undoubtedly stars, but some of the larger ones actually appear to be snow. So by using the same ink color as I used to stamp this image, I'm going to make those really large snowflakes disappear like magic. All I need to do is touch the end of my blender pen to my ink pad, and the pen absorbs a small amount of ink. Now I can go to my card front and start blotting out those snowflakes. Now that's easy enough in the sky, but what about all of those flakes that appear to be falling through the trees? Well, that's no problem either. All I need to do to get into these intricate spaces is to hold my blender pen straight up and down to the paper. When I have the pen on an angle, there's a larger surface of the pen that touches the paper. But when I hold the pen straight up and down, only the very tip makes contact with the surface. That allows me to get into tiny little spaces without blotting out stamp lines I need to keep. An alternate method of inking your blender pen is to use an acrylic block to get some of the ink for blending. Just stamp the acrylic block and then take ink from there instead of the ink pad. Using an acrylic block eliminates any possibility of degrading your ink pad. In the end, you've gone from an apparently snowy sky to more of a simple night sky that can be used for a lot of seasons. In this case, fall might be best since these trees have no leaves. But if we're going to have fall, here's yet another alternative for transforming the image. And there you have it, a new fall scene. If you've enjoyed seeing these easy techniques, I hope you'll give me a thumbs up below the video. I also value your comments on what you liked best. Feel free to leave comments or questions for me and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Meanwhile, if you'd like to see more of my videos, hit the subscribe button. And finally, if you want to be notified whenever I upload new content, just click that little notification bell beside the subscribe button below. Thanks again for watching. Please remember to share your beautiful handcrafted creations with the world that needs them so desperately. I hope to see you again soon. Have a blessed day.